He was a billionaire who thought nothing in his empire could surprise him. Until one stormy night, he noticed his maid's daughter tugging at her sleeves, hiding bruises. The sight unsettled him. Who could have hurt her inside his own home? Driven by suspicion, he turned to the cameras that watched every corner of his penthouse. What he discovered on those recordings stunned him more than any betrayal in business. Because the face behind those bruises was someone far closer than he ever imagined. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The city glowed beneath the storm, its towers shimmering like blades of steel piercing the clouds. At the very top of one of those towers lived Zaid Khan, a man whose name carried weight in every boardroom and every newspaper headline. His penthouse was a fortress of glass and marble, a place where silence reigned and only the hum of machines reminded him that life still moved around him. He had wealth, power, and influence, yet none of it filled the emptiness that lingered in his chest. For years, Maryam had worked in his home. She was steady, loyal, and invisible in the way only the best staff could be. Her daughter Aisha often accompanied her, a quiet presence who seemed almost too delicate for the harshness of the world. Zaid rarely paid her much attention, but he respected Maryam enough to allow the girl to stay. That evening, as rain tapped against the tall windows, Zaid noticed something that unsettled him. Aisha sat curled in the corner of a living room, her sleeves tugged down tightly over her wrists. She avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she shifted, the fabric slipped for a moment, and Zaid caught sight of a dark mark on her skin. It wasn't the kind of bruise one gets from bumping into furniture. It was deeper, deliberate, and it carried a story she was trying desperately to hide. Zaid's instinct sharpened. Years of negotiating with ruthless men had taught him to read the smallest signs of weakness, deception, or fear. What he saw in Aisha's eyes was not clumsiness, it was terror. She quickly pulled her sleeve back down, whispering something to her mother, who gave her a gentle pat. But the image of that bruise burned into Zaid's mind. Later, when the staff had retired, Zaid sat alone in his study. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside him. He poured himself a drink, staring at the amber liquid as though it might reveal answers. Who had hurt her? Maryam? Impossible. She adored her daughter. Someone at school? A relative? The questions gnawed at him, each one heavier than the last. He rose abruptly, his decision made. The penthouse was equipped with cameras in every hallway, every entrance, every blind spot. Zaid had installed them not only for protection, but because he believed in control. Nothing happened in his domain without his knowledge. Tonight, he would use that control to uncover the truth. The security room was sleek, lined with monitors that glowed in the dim light. Zaid sat before them, rewinding the footage. Hours of recordings flickered past, Maryam cleaning, Aisha reading quietly, staff moving about their duties. At first, it was ordinary, almost boring. But then, something shifted. On one screen, Aisha appeared in the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water. A shadow entered the frame. The figure moved quickly, almost too quickly, and before Zaid could process what he was seeing, Aisha flinched. The shadow raised a hand, and though the camera angle didn't capture the full impact, the truth was undeniable. Aisha stumbled back, clutching her arm. Zaid froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. He replayed the footage, leaning closer, unwilling to believe what his eyes were telling him. The figure stepped into the light, and Zaid's breath caught. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone from outside. It was someone he knew, someone he trusted, someone who had no right to be standing there with violence in their hands. The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the glass walls of the penthouse. Zaid sat motionless, the glow of the monitor painting his face in cold light. For years, he had prided himself on control, on knowing every detail of his empire. Yet here, in his own home, something had slipped past him. A child had been hurt, and the culprit was closer than he had ever imagined. He closed his eyes, memories flooding back, his own childhood, the scars he carried, the promises he had made to himself. He had sworn never to let anyone suffer the way he had. And yet, here was Aisha, hiding bruises, silenced by fear. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal, heavier than any fortune. The image on the screen lingered, the figure's face etched into his mind. Zaid clenched his fists, determination replacing shock. Whoever had done this would answer for it. He would uncover the truth fully, no matter how painful, no matter how close to home it was. As he rose from the chair, the storm began to ease, leaving behind a heavy silence. He walked past the living room, where Aisha lay asleep on the couch, her small frame curled beneath a blanket. For the first time in years, Zaid felt something stir in his chest, a sense of duty, of protection, of resolve. The billionaire who had conquered the world now faced a battle within his own walls. The monitor's glow had faded, but the last image remained burned into his mind, the unmistakable face of the person who had raised a hand against Aisha. And as he stood there, staring at the sleeping girl, a thought whispered through him like the storm's dying wind. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come not from enemies, but from those closest to us. He wondered how many secrets were hidden in plain sight, how many truths we ignore until they force themselves upon us. And he knew that if you want to see what people are truly capable of, you only have to look at the moments they think no one is watching. Zaid's jaw tightened. He would not let this go. He would not let her suffer in silence. The next chapter of his life had just begun, and it would not be written in contracts or profits, but in the choices he made to protect the innocent. If you want to know what Zaid saw on those cameras and how he will confront the truth, stay with me as the story unfolds, because the storm has only just begun. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. Zaid stood in the dim corridor, the image from the monitor carved into his mind like a scar. He had seen the face clearly, and the betrayal it carried was unbearable. It wasn't a stranger, not some outsider sneaking into his home. It was someone who belonged here, someone who had walked these halls freely. He moved slowly, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder. The penthouse, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage filled with secrets. He paused outside the guest quarters, listening. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. Yet he knew the truth was hiding behind one of those doors. Zaid's chest tightened. He had built his empire on trust and loyalty, but tonight those words fell hollow. He thought of Aisha, asleep on the couch, her fragile body curled beneath the blanket. The bruise on her arm was not just a mark. It was a message, a silent cry for help. And he had ignored it until now. He returned to the security room, replaying the footage again. The figure's movements were unmistakable, the aggression undeniable. Zaid leaned closer, studying every frame. The hand that struck Aisha belonged to someone he had allowed into his home without question. His jaw clenched as the realization deepened. The culprit was one of his own staff, a man who had worked under his roof for months, blending into the background like furniture. Zaid had barely noticed him before, but now every detail stood out. The way he lingered near the kitchen, the way his eyes followed Aisha when he thought no one was watching. Zaid's pulse quickened. He felt anger rising, sharp and consuming. But beneath it was something else. Guilt. He had prided himself on control, yet he had failed to protect the most vulnerable person in his home. The thought gnawed at him, heavier than any business failure. He shut off the monitors and walked back into the living room. Aisha stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Zaid knelt beside her, studying her face. She looked peaceful now, but he knew the nightmares she carried were real. He whispered to himself, a vow that no one else would hear. She would not suffer again. The next morning, the penthouse was filled with the usual routine. The staff moved quietly, preparing breakfast, tidying rooms. Yet Zaid's eyes were sharper than ever. He watched every gesture, every glance. And when the man from the footage entered the kitchen, Zaid felt his blood boil. The man smiled politely, unaware that his secret had been exposed. Zaid studied him, noting the casual confidence, the way he carried himself as though nothing had happened. It was a mask, and Zaid had seen beneath it. He waited until the staff dispersed, then called Maryam into his study. She entered nervously, sensing the tension. Zaid gestured for her to sit, his voice calm but firm. He asked about Aisha, about the bruises. Maryam's eyes widened, her hands trembling. She insisted she had never harmed her daughter, that she loved her more than life itself. Zaid believed her. He had seen the footage. He told her what he had discovered, the truth hidden in the cameras. Maryam gasped, tears filling her eyes. She had trusted the staff, trusted the man who had betrayed them. Her voice broke as she asked why anyone would hurt her child. Zaid placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. He promised her that justice would be served. He would not allow this betrayal to continue. The storm inside him had become a fire, and it demanded action. That evening, Zaid confronted the man. He called him into the security room, the monitors glowing in the dark. The footage played silently, the truth undeniable. The man's face paled, his mask shattering. He stammered excuses, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant to hurt her. Zaid's voice was cold, sharper than steel. He told the man that there was no misunderstanding, no excuse. The cameras had captured everything. The man tried to plead, but Zaid silenced him with a single gesture. He had no patience for lies. The confrontation ended with the man escorted out of the penthouse, his employment terminated instantly. But Zaid knew this was not enough. The bruises on Aisha's arm were not just physical. They were wounds that cut deeper, scars that would linger. He had to do more than remove the threat. He had to rebuild trust, to protect her in ways he had never protected anyone before. That night, Zaid sat with Aisha. She was hesitant at first, her eyes wary. But slowly, she began to speak. Her voice was soft, trembling, but each word carried weight. She admitted she had been afraid, that she hadn't wanted to burden her mother. She had tried to hide the bruises, believing no one would care. Zaid listened, every word piercing him. He realized how blind he had been, how consumed by his empire that he had ignored the pain in front of him. He told her she was safe now, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. His voice carried a conviction she had never heard before, and for the first time, she believed him. The penthouse felt different after that. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken promises. Zaid had discovered a truth that shook him, but it had also awakened something he thought he had lost. He had found a purpose beyond wealth, beyond power. As he watched Aisha drift to sleep, he felt the weight of his vow pressing on him. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Trust had been broken, innocence scarred. But he also knew that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not in boardrooms, but in the quiet corners of our lives, where the people we love need us most. The storm outside had ended, but a storm within had only begun. And Zaid was ready to face it, no matter the cost. The glow of the city lights seeped through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Zaid stood there, watching over Aisha, his mind replaying the betrayal he had uncovered. He thought of how easily secrets hide in plain sight, how often we overlook the signs until they demand to be seen. And he wondered how many other truths lay buried, waiting for the moment when the cameras, or our own eyes, finally reveal them. He tightened his grip on the railing, his resolve unshakable. The billionaire who had conquered empires now stood guard over a single child, and in that moment he understood that this was the fight that truly mattered. Sometimes the most shocking revelations are not about strangers. but about the people we thought we knew. And when those truths surface, they force us to choose who we are. Zaid had made his choice. He would protect her, no matter what. If you want to see how Zaid's vow transformed his life and what dangers still lurk in the shadows, stay with me. The story is only beginning, and the next chapter will test him in ways he has never faced before. The days that followed were unlike anything Zaid had ever experienced. His penthouse, once a monument to solitude, now felt alive with tension and fragile hope. Aisha moved quietly through the rooms, her presence delicate, like a bird unsure if it was safe to spread its wings. Miriam hovered protectively, her eyes constantly scanning, as though danger might still be hiding in the corners. Zaid found himself watching them both, not as an employer, but as a man who had been shaken awake. He had spent years building walls of glass and steel, yet those walls had failed to shield the one person who needed protection most. That realization gnawed at him, and it drove him to act. He began by changing the environment. The staff was reduced, every new hire vetted personally by him. Security protocols were tightened, cameras recalibrated, blind spots eliminated. But he knew locks and lenses could only do so much. The real battle was not against intruders. It was against the silence that had allowed the Bruises to remain hidden. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Zaid invited Aisha to sit with him on the balcony. The city stretched endlessly below, its lights flickering like stars trapped on earth. She hesitated at first, clutching the railing as though it might anchor her. Zaid spoke gently, telling her about his own childhood, about the scars he carried that no one had seen. He didn't give details, but his voice carried the weight of truth. Aisha listened, her eyes wide. For the first time, she realized the man everyone feared in business was not untouchable. He had known pain too. Slowly, she began to share pieces of her own story. Not everything, not yet, but enough to open a door. She admitted she had been afraid to speak, afraid no one would believe her. Zaid's chest tightened. He told her she never had to hide again, that her voice mattered. His words were not polished speeches. They were raw, unpracticed, but they carried a conviction that reached her. At that moment, something shifted. A fragile thread of trust began to weave between them. But trust was not enough. Zaid knew the man he had expelled was only a symptom of a deeper problem. Violence like that did not appear out of nowhere. It thrived in silence, in shadows, in the spaces where people looked away. He could not allow that silence to return. He began investigating quietly. Discreet calls were made, background checks revisited. He wanted to know everything about the man who had betrayed his household. What he discovered unsettled him further. The man had a history, short-term jobs, complaints that had never been pursued, whispers of misconduct buried under paperwork. No one had ever held him accountable. Until now. Zaid realized how easily predators slipped through cracks, how often systems failed the vulnerable. It infuriated him. He had spent his life mastering systems, markets, corporations, governments. Now he saw a system that was broken in ways far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Aisha began to change. She still carried her fear, but in Zaid's presence, she started to stand a little taller. She asked questions, small at first, about the city, about his work. He answered patiently, surprised at how much he wanted to share. He found himself explaining things he had never told anyone, how deals were made, how risks were calculated, how power was wielded. She listened intently, her curiosity a spark that reminded him of something he had long forgotten, the joy of teaching, of guiding. Miriam noticed the change too. She watched her daughter laugh softly at one of Zaid's rare jokes, and her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked him quietly one night, her voice trembling. Zaid shook his head. He told her he was only doing what should have been done long ago. But inside he felt something stir, a sense of belonging he had never allowed himself to feel. Yet shadows lingered. One night, as Zaid reviewed the latest security reports, he noticed something strange. A camera feed flickered, then went dark for a few seconds before returning. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Zaid's instinct screamed. He replayed the footage, analyzing every frame. Someone had tampered with the system. His pulse quickened. The man he had expelled was gone, but the threat was not. Someone else was watching. Someone who knew how to slip past his defenses. The realization chilled him. He had underestimated the danger. The next day, he said nothing to Maryam or Aisha. He didn't want to alarm them. But he doubled the guards, replaced the locks, and began his own investigation. He traced the breach back to an external signal, a remote attempt to override the cameras. Whoever it was, they were skilled. This was no accident. That night, as he stood by the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, he felt the weight of his vow pressing harder than ever. Protecting Aisha was no longer just about removing one man. It was about confronting a darkness that reached further than he had imagined. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the glow of the hall. She asked if he was worried. He hesitated, then told her the truth. Yes, he was. But he also told her something else. That fear was not weakness. It was a signal, a reminder to stand stronger. She nodded, her eyes steady. In that moment, Zaid realized something profound. He was not just protecting her. She was changing him. She was teaching him that strength was not measured in wealth or power, but in the courage to face what frightened you most. The night deepened, the city humming below. Zaid knew the battle ahead would test him in ways he had never faced. But he also knew he was no longer fighting alone. Aisha's trust, Maryam's faith, and his own resolve had bound them together. And as he looked out at the endless skyline, he whispered a promise to himself. No matter what shadows came, he would not let them win. The faint flicker of the security monitor caught his eye again, a reminder that the threat was still out there, watching, waiting. But Zaid's jaw tightened, his resolve unshakable. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who strike openly, but the ones who hide in silence, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. He would not let his guard down again. And as the night wrapped around him, he wondered how many secrets still lingered in the dark, waiting to be revealed. Because if the cameras had shown him one truth, they could show him more. And the next revelation might be even more shocking than the last. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the hidden enemy, and how far he will go to protect the girl who has changed his life, stay with me. The storm has only just begun, and the next part will take us deeper into the shadows. The city's pulse throbbed beneath the penthouse, neon lights flickering like restless signals in the night. Zaid stood alone in the security chamber, the monitors casting their cold glow across his face. The breach he had discovered was no accident. Someone had deliberately reached into his fortress, probing for weakness. He replayed the flicker again and again, each frame whispering the same truth. The enemy was not gone. He leaned back, his mind racing. The man he had expelled was only a pawn. There was a larger hand at play, one that knew how to slip past defenses, one that understood the value of silence. Zaid had spent his life dismantling rivals in boardrooms, but this was different. This was personal, and it was happening inside his home. The next morning, the penthouse carried a strange tension. Maryam moved briskly, her eyes darting toward her daughter every few minutes. Aisha sat quietly at the breakfast table, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass surface. Zaid watched them both, his thoughts heavy. He wanted to tell them about the breach, but he held back. Fear was already a shadow in their lives. He would not feed it further. Instead, he made calls. Discreet, urgent calls to people who owed him favors. Within hours, a team arrived, specialists in digital security, men and women who spoke in codes and algorithms. They combed through the system, tracing signals, mapping intrusions. Their verdict chilled him. The breach had originated from outside the city, routed through layers of disguise. Whoever it was, they were skilled, patient, and determined. Zaid dismissed the team with instructions to remain silent. He did not want whispers spreading. He returned to the balcony, staring at the skyline. The city looked peaceful, but he knew better. Peace was often a mask, and beneath it, chaos waited. That evening, he sat with Aisha again. She asked him why he looked troubled. He hesitated, then told her a story, not about the breach, but about his past. He spoke of a time when he had lost everything, when betrayal had nearly destroyed him. He told her how he had rebuilt himself, brick by brick, until he stood where he was now. His voice carried a lesson. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it. Aisha listened, her eyes reflecting the city lights. She asked him if fear ever truly goes away. He shook his head. No, it never disappears. But it can be transformed. It can become fuel. She nodded slowly, as though storing the words deep inside. Later that night, Zaid returned to the security room. He studied the feeds, every angle, every shadow. And then he saw it, something subtle, almost invisible. A figure lingering near the service entrance, just beyond the reach of the cameras. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Someone had been there. His pulse quickened. He rewound the footage, zooming in. The figure was blurred, hidden beneath a hood. But the posture, the way they moved, it was deliberate. This was not a random trespasser. This was someone who knew the building, someone who had studied its rhythms. Zaid felt the fire inside him ignite. He would not wait for them to strike again. He would confront the threat head-on. The following day, he arranged a meeting with the building's management. He demanded access to external surveillance, to every camera within a mile radius. They hesitated, but his authority was undeniable. Within hours, he had the footage. He studied it meticulously, piecing together fragments. The hooded figure appeared again, slipping through alleys, vanishing into crowds. Always watching, never approaching. Zaid realized this was not just about Aisha. This was about him. Someone wanted to break him, not through contracts or markets, but through the people he had sworn to protect. It was a strategy he recognized. Attack the heart, and the empire crumbles. That night, he gathered Miriam and Aisha. He spoke plainly, his voice steady. He told them there was danger, that someone was watching. Miriam's eyes widened, fear tightening her grip on her daughter. Aisha looked at him silently, her face pale but resolute. He promised them safety. He promised them that no harm would come. But inside, he knew promises were fragile. Safety was not guaranteed. It had to be fought for. The penthouse transformed into a fortress. Guards patrolled the halls. Sensors scanned every entrance. Alarms were tested and retested. Yet Zaid knew walls could only delay the inevitable. The real battle would be fought in the shadows, where the enemy waited. One evening, as the city drowned in twilight, Zaid stood by the window. He saw his reflection staring back, a man who had conquered empires, yet now stood as a guardian. He thought of Aisha, of the trust she had begun to place in him. He thought of Miriam, whose faith had been shaken but not broken. And he thought of the hooded figure, lurking in the dark, waiting for the moment to strike. The storm inside him grew. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the empty room. He would not let them win. The night deepened, and the city hummed below. Somewhere out there, the enemy watched. Somewhere out there, the next move was being planned. Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his resolve unshakable. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with armies or wealth, but with the courage to stand against the unseen. And as he turned away from the window, his eyes burning with determination, he knew the next chapter would demand everything he had. The cameras had revealed one truth, but more remained hidden. And when those truths surfaced, they would test him in ways he had never faced before. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the shadow that stalks his home, and how far he will go to protect the girl who has changed his life, stay with me. The darkness is closing in, and the next part will bring the confrontation into the light. The night was restless, the city humming like a machine that refused to sleep. Zaid sat in his study, the glow of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. The hooded figure had appeared again, slipping through the edges of surveillance like smoke. Every movement was calculated, every step deliberate. Whoever they weren't just watching, they were waiting. Zaid's mind churned with possibilities. Was this connected to the man he had expelled? Or was it something larger, something that had been set in motion long before Aisha's bruises were discovered? He had built his empire on anticipating threats, but this one was different. It wasn't about contracts or rivals. It was about shadows creeping into his home. He rose abruptly, pacing the length of the room. His reflection in the glass wall looked like a stranger, a man burdened not by wealth, but by responsibility. He thought of Aisha, her fragile trust beginning to take root. He thought of Miriam, her faith trembling, but still intact. And he thought of the figure outside, the silent predator circling like a wolf. The following day, Zaid made a decision. He would not wait for the enemy to strike. He would draw them out. He instructed his guards to reduce their visible presence, to make the penthouse appear vulnerable. It was a calculated risk, a trap designed to lure the intruder closer. Hours passed, the city shifting from daylight to dusk. The penthouse seemed quieter than usual, its corridors echoing with emptiness. Zaid positioned himself in the security chamber, eyes locked on the feeds. He waited, patient as a hunter. Then it happened. A shadow slipped through the service entrance, moving with precision. The hooded figure stepped into the corridor, pausing as if listening. Zaid's pulse quickened. He zoomed in, studying every detail. The way the figure's shoulders hunched, the way their hands flexed nervously. This was no ordinary trespasser. The figure moved deeper into the penthouse, heading toward the living room. Zaid rose from his chair, silent and deliberate. He left the security room, his footsteps muffled against the carpet. He knew the cameras would capture everything, but this confrontation had to be face to face. He entered the living room just as the figure stepped into the glow of the city lights. For a moment, they froze, startled by his presence. Zaid's eyes locked onto theirs, though the hood concealed most of the face. "Take it off," Zaid said, his voice low but commanding. The figure hesitated, then slowly lowered the hood. Zaid's breath caught. It wasn't who he expected. It wasn't the expelled staff member. It was someone else entirely, someone who had no right to be here, yet whose presence carried a familiarity that unsettled him. The intruder was a young man, barely older than Aisha. His eyes were sharp, filled with defiance, but beneath them lingered something else, fear. Zaid studied him, his mind racing. "Why are you here?" he demanded. The young man's voice trembled, but his words were steady. "I came for her." Zaid's chest tightened. "For Aisha." The intruder nodded. "She doesn't belong here. You don't understand what's happening." Zaid stepped closer, his anger simmering. "Explain." The young man hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Aisha slept. His voice dropped to a whisper. "She's in danger. Not from me. From people you don't even see. They're watching her, using her. I came to protect her." Zaid's mind reeled. Was this truth or manipulation? He had seen the bruises, seen the betrayal. But now another layer unfolded, one that hinted at forces beyond his walls. The young man's eyes burned with urgency. "You think your cameras can stop them? They're bigger than you, bigger than this building. I've been following them, tracking them. That's why I'm here. To warn her." Zaid's fists clenched. He wanted to dismiss the words, to call them lies. But something in the young man's tone carried conviction. He wasn't just an intruder. He was a messenger. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Zaid spoke. "If you're telling the truth, prove it." The young man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device. He placed it on the table, its screen flickering to life. Images appeared, grainy surveillance shots, documents, coded messages. Zaid leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. The evidence was undeniable. Someone had been watching Aisha long before the bruises appeared. His chest tightened. The hooded figure wasn't the enemy. He was a witness to something larger, something darker. The young man's voice broke the silence. You have power. Use it. Don't just protect her inside these walls. Protect her from what's coming. Zaid stared at the screen, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had thought the battle was within his home. Now he realized it stretched far beyond, into networks and shadows he had never considered. He looked at the young man, his voice steady. If you're right, then you've just changed everything. The city lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Zaid felt the storm inside him grow, fiercer than ever. He had uncovered betrayal, expelled the abuser, and fortified his home. But now he faced something greater, a conspiracy that reached beyond walls and cameras. He turned toward the hallway, where Aisha slept peacefully. His vow deepened. He would not only guard her from the threats inside, he would shield her from the darkness outside. The young man's eyes met his, filled with urgency. They won't stop. They'll come again. And when they do, you'll have to choose how far you're willing to go. Zaid's jaw tightened. He already knew his answer. Sometimes the most shocking truths are not the ones we uncover in our homes, but the ones that reveal how fragile safety truly is. And as Zaid stood there, the city humming below, he realized the fight had only just begun. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the conspiracy that threatens Aisha and how far he will go to protect her, stay with me. The next chapter will pull us deeper into the storm, where every choice carries consequences. The city's rhythm pulsed like a restless heartbeat, neon veins stretching across the skyline. Zaid sat in silence, the device the intruder had left glowing faintly on the table. The images and coded fragments it contained were more than evidence. They were a map of something vast, something hidden. He scrolled through them, each file a thread leading into a labyrinth of surveillance networks, anonymous accounts, and encrypted exchanges. Whoever was behind this had been watching Aisha long before bruises appeared on her skin. He leaned back, his mind racing. For years, he had fought battles in boardrooms, dismantling rivals with contracts and strategy. But this was different. This was a war fought in shadows, where the enemy was faceless and the weapons invisible. He realized he could not fight it alone. The next morning, he made discreet calls to contacts outside his empire. Men and women who owed him favors, people who operated in the gray spaces between law and secrecy. Within hours, he had assembled a small circle in a private suite downtown. They were analysts, investigators, and former operatives, each carrying scars from battles the public never knew existed. Zaid laid the device on the table, its screen flickering with encrypted files. "This is what I found," he said, his voice steady. "Someone has been watching her. Someone has been watching us." The room fell silent as they studied the evidence. One of the analysts, a woman with sharp eyes, spoke first. "These aren't amateurs. The encryption is military grade. Whoever's behind this has resources." Another leaned forward. "And motive. They're not just observing. They're cataloging, tracking patterns. This isn't random, it's targeted." Zaid's jaw tightened. "Targeted at her?" The woman nodded. "Yes. But through her at you. They know who you are. They know what you represent. This isn't about a child. It's about leverage." The word struck him like a blade. Leverage. In his world, everything was currency. Information, alliances, secrets. And now, someone had chosen Aisha as the currency to break him. He dismissed the team with instructions to dig deeper, to trace every signal, every shadow. As they left, he remained behind, staring at the city through the glass wall. For the first time, he felt the weight of vulnerability pressing against him. He had built an empire of steel and glass, yet it had cracks. And through those cracks, the enemy had slipped. That evening, he returned to the penthouse. Miriam greeted him with weary eyes. her voice trembling as she asked if the danger was gone. He told her the truth, it wasn't. But he promised her it would be faced. Aisha listened silently, her gaze steady. She didn't flinch, didn't turn away. In her silence, Zaid saw courage. Later that night, he sat with her again. She asked him why people would want to hurt her. He hesitated, then told her something she had never heard before. Sometimes, he said, the world doesn't attack you because of who you are, but because of what you mean to someone else. You matter to me, and that makes you a target. Her eyes widened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "Then I'll be strong." The words pierced him. He realized she was no longer just a child hiding bruises. She was becoming something more, someone who understood the weight of danger and the necessity of resilience. The following day, the investigation deepened. His team traced signals through layers of disguise, uncovering fragments of communication. They found references to the girl, coded exchanges about the asset. Zaid's blood boiled. They had reduced her to a commodity, a pawn in a game she never chose. He demanded names, locations, motives. The analysts hesitated. "It's bigger than we thought," one said. "This isn't just one group. It's a network. And they're watching more than just her." Zaid's chest tightened. "Then we cut through the network." The analyst shook his head. "It won't be easy. They're protected, hidden behind layers of power." Zaid leaned forward, his voice cold. "So am I." That night, he returned to the penthouse with a plan forming in his mind. He walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing. He thought of the hooded young man, of the urgency in his voice. He thought of the bruises, of the silence that had hidden them. And he thought of the files, the coded exchanges that had turned Aisha into a target. He stood by the window, the city lights flickering below. He whispered to himself, a vow that carried through the empty room. He would not let them win. The hours stretched, the night deepened. And then it happened. A notification flashed across the device. A new message, encrypted but traceable. His team intercepted it, decoding fragments. The words chilled him. Phase 2 begins. Zaid's pulse quickened. Phase 2. The enemy was moving. He turned toward the hallway, where Aisha slept peacefully. He felt the storm inside him grow, fiercer than ever. He had uncovered betrayal, expelled the abuser, confronted the intruder. Now he faced something greater, a conspiracy that had declared war. The city hummed below, unaware of the battle unfolding above. Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his resolve unshakable. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are not fought with armies, but with silence and shadows. And as he stood there, the storm closing in, he knew the next chapter would demand everything he had. The device flickered again, another coded message appearing. Zaid stared at it, his jaw tightening. The enemy was closer than ever. And as the night wrapped around him, he whispered a promise. No matter how deep the shadows, he would protect her. The monitors glowed, the city lights burned, and the storm inside him raged. The battle had begun. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the network that has targeted Aisha, and how far he will go to dismantle the conspiracy, stay with me. The next part will bring the clash into the open, where secrets will be exposed and choices will carry consequences. The city's heartbeat throbbed beneath the glass towers, restless and unyielding. Zaid Khan stood at the edge of his balcony, the wind tugging at his suit, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The coded message, Phase 2 begins, still echoed in his mind. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. He had spent nights fortifying his home, protecting Aisha from the shadows that crept closer. But now he understood, the battle could not be won from behind walls. He had to step into the storm. He summoned his private circle again, this time in a discreet warehouse far from the glittering skyline. The analysts spread maps and digital projections across steel tables, their voices low but urgent. The network they had uncovered was vast, stretching across borders, hidden behind layers of anonymity. Yet fragments of communication revealed something tangible, a meeting point, a hub where signals converged. Zaid studied the coordinates, his jaw tightening. It was an abandoned district on the city's edge, a place where factories had died and silence had taken root. Perfect for shadows to thrive. He made his decision swiftly. He would go there himself. The team protested. "It's too dangerous," one said. "You're their target. If you walk into their territory, you're giving them exactly what they want." Zaid's voice was cold, steady. "They already want me, but they won't expect me to come to them. That's how we take control." That night, he prepared. He left the penthouse under heavy guard, but only a few accompanied him into the district. The streets were deserted, littered with rust and decay. The air smelled of dust and forgotten industry. Every step echoed. Every shadow seemed alive. They reached the factory, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Zaid moved cautiously, his senses sharpened. He had faced rivals in boardrooms, but this was different. Here, the stakes were not profit or power. They were survival. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Zaid signaled his men to hold. A figure emerged from the darkness, hooded, deliberate. For a moment, Zaid thought it was the young intruder again. But as the figure stepped closer, he realized this was someone else. Older, hardened, carrying the weight of authority. The man's voice was calm, almost mocking. "You shouldn't have come here, Khan." Zaid's eyes narrowed. "You've been watching her." "Why?" The man smiled faintly. "Because she matters. Not for who she is, but for what she represents. You built an empire, and empires attract enemies. She is your weakness, and weaknesses are leverage." Zaid's fist clenched. "She is not leveraged. She is under my protection." The man's smile faded. "Protection? You think cameras and guards can shield her from us? We are everywhere. We are patient. And we don't stop." The words cut deep, but Zaid refused to flinch. He stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Then you've underestimated me. I won't stop either." The silence stretched, heavy with tension. Then, without warning, more figures emerged from the shadows surrounding them. Zaid's guards raised their weapons, but the enemy did not attack. They stood still, watching, waiting. The older man spoke again. "This is only the beginning. Phase 2 is not about bruises or fear. It's about control. And you, Khan, are about to lose yours." Zaid's chest tightened, but his resolve did not waver. He had faced betrayal, uncovered secrets, and expelled threats. Now he stood at the edge of something larger, something darker. He realized the enemy was not just watching, they were orchestrating. He turned to his men, his voice steady. "We leave. Now." They moved swiftly, retreating through the factory's broken halls. The figures did not follow. They simply watched, their silence more menacing than any attack. Back in the car, Zaid stared out at the deserted streets. His mind churned with fury and determination. The enemy had revealed themselves, but only partially. They had shown their reach, their confidence. But they had also made a mistake. They had underestimated his resolve. When he returned to the penthouse, Aisha was awake, waiting. She looked at him with wide eyes, sensing the storm in his expression. He sat beside her, his voice softer than it had been in years. "They want to use you against me, but I won't let them. You are not leveraged. You are not a pawn. You are stronger than they know." She listened silently, then whispered, "What if they come again?" Zaid's gaze hardened. "Then we face them. Together." The words carried weight, a promise forged in fire. For the first time, Aisha saw not just a billionaire, but a guardian willing to fight beyond walls and wealth. The city hummed outside, unaware of the war unfolding in its shadows. Zaid stood by the window, his reflection staring back. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the empty room. He would dismantle the network, piece by piece, no matter how deep it ran. The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle ahead would not be won quickly. It would demand sacrifice, strategy, and relentless pursuit. But he was ready. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who strike openly, but the ones who wait in silence, confident in their power. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his resolve unshakable, he knew the next chapter would bring the confrontation into the light. The monitors flickered, the device glowed, and the city pulsed below. The war had begun, and Zaid was no longer just defending. He was preparing to attack. If you want to see how Zaid launches his counterstrike against the network and how far he will go to protect Aisha, stay with me. The next part will bring the clash into the open, where secrets unravel and choices carry consequences. The city's underbelly was a place Zaid had rarely seen. He had lived his life in towers of glass, in boardrooms where power was measured in contracts and signatures. But now he found himself in alleys where shadows whispered, where silence carried secrets. His decision to attack the network had already set things in motion. He could no longer wait for them to strike. He had to dismantle them piece by piece. The coordinates his team had uncovered led him to a forgotten district, a place where neon lights didn't reach and the air smelled of rust and smoke. He moved with precision, accompanied by only 2 trusted men. The rest of his guards remained behind, protecting Miriam and Aisha. This mission was not about defense, it was about confrontation. Inside a derelict warehouse, his team had traced signals converging. Zaid stepped through the broken doors, his footsteps echoing against steel beams. The space was vast, littered with remnants of machinery long abandoned. Yet it wasn't empty. Screens flickered in the distance, casting eerie glows across the walls. He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning. The screens displayed fragments of surveillance, streets, schools, homes. And among them, images of Aisha. His chest tightened. They had been watching her everywhere, cataloging her movements, reducing her life to data points. A voice broke the silence. You came sooner than expected. Zaid turned sharply. From the shadows, figures emerged, their faces hidden behind masks. They moved with confidence, surrounding him. At the center stood a man with piercing eyes, his presence commanding. You built an empire, the man said, his tone calm. But empires fall when their foundations crack. She is your foundation, Khan, and we will use her to break you. Zaid's jaw tightened. You think fear will make me surrender? You don't understand me at all. The man smirked. We understand you perfectly. You've spent your life controlling everything. But control is an illusion. We've already taken it from you. Zaid stepped closer, his voice sharp. Then you've underestimated me. I don't surrender. I fight. The tension thickened. One of the masked figures lunged forward, but Zaid's men intercepted, the clash echoing through the warehouse. Chaos erupted, steel against steel, fists against flesh. Zaid moved with precision, his instincts honed from years of battles of a different kind. He wasn't a soldier, but he was relentless. The fight raged, shadows colliding in bursts of violence. Zaid's men held their ground, but the enemy was skilled, coordinated. It wasn't random aggression, it was strategy. Every move was calculated, every strike designed to test his resolve. Zaid grabbed one of the masked figures, slamming him against a wall. He ripped off the mask, revealing a young face, hardened by desperation. The man's eyes burned with defiance. You can't stop us, he spat. We are everywhere. Zaid's grip tightened. Then I'll tear you apart everywhere. The words carried weight, a vow forged in fury. He released the man, letting him collapse to the floor. The fight slowed, the masked figures retreating into shadows. The leader remained, his eyes locked on Zaid. This is only the beginning, the leader said. Phase 2 was the warning. Phase 3 will be the strike. And when it comes, You won't be able to protect her. Zaid's chest heaved, his fist clenched. You've already lost. Because you've shown me your face. And now I'll hunt you. The leader smirked, then vanished into the darkness, his men following. The warehouse fell silent, the screens flickering one last time before shutting down. Zaid stood in the emptiness, his breath heavy. He had faced them, clashed with them, but he knew this was only the surface. The network was deeper, stronger, more dangerous than he had imagined. Yet he felt no fear. He felt resolved. He returned to the penthouse, his clothes torn, his knuckles bruised. Miriam rushed to him, her voice trembling. What happened? Zaid looked at her, his eyes steady. The war has begun. Aisha appeared in the doorway, her gaze fixed on him. She saw the marks of battle, the storm in his expression. She whispered softly, "Did you stop them?" Zaid knelt before her, his voice firm. "Not yet. But I will. They think you're my weakness. They don't know you're my strength." Her eyes widened, her lips trembling. For the first time, she smiled faintly, a fragile spark of hope breaking through fear. That night, Zaid stood by the window, the city lights burning below. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the silence. He would dismantle the network, no matter how deep it ran, no matter how many shadows it hid behind. The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle ahead would not be won with wealth or power, but with relentless pursuit. He would fight in alleys, in warehouses, in the hidden corners of the city. He would fight until the network was ashes. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are not fought with armies, but with resolve. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his reflection staring back, he knew the next chapter would demand everything he had. The monitors flickered, the device glowed, and the city pulsed below. The war had begun, and Zaid was no longer just defending. He was attacking. If you want to see how Zaid launches his full counterstrike against the network, and how far he will go to protect Aisha, stay with me. The next part will bring the confrontation into the open, where secrets unravel and choices carry consequences. The city was restless, its veins glowing with restless neon, but Zaid no longer looked at it with the eyes of a man who owned towers. He looked at it as a battlefield. The warehouse confrontation had changed everything. He had seen their faces, heard their threats, and felt the weight of their confidence. They believed they could break him by turning Aisha into leverage. They believed he would fold under pressure. They were wrong. He spent the next 48 hours without sleep, his team working in shifts around him. The device left by the hooded youth had become their compass, guiding them through encrypted channels and hidden servers. Every fragment of data was a thread, and Zaid pulled at them relentlessly. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The network wasn't a faceless monolith. It was a web of cells, each operating independently, connected only through coded exchanges. One cell stood out. It operated from within the city, disguised as a logistics company. On the surface, it moved shipments of steel and machinery. But beneath the paperwork, it moved information, data harvested from surveillance, identities traded like currency. And among those files, Aisha's name appeared again and again. Zaid's jaw tightened as he studied the evidence. This was no longer about defense. This was about dismantling them piece by piece until nothing remained. He called his men together, outlining the plan. They would strike the logistics hub, seize its servers, and expose its operators. The night of the operation, the city's industrial district was cloaked in silence. Zaid moved with precision, his men flanking him. They breached the warehouse swiftly, their footsteps echoing against steel walls. Inside, rows of crates lined the floor, but it was the back room that mattered. There, servers hummed, their lights blinking like watchful eyes. The operators were caught off guard. A handful of men scrambled to shut down systems, but Zaid's team overpowered them. Zaid himself strode to the central console, his reflection flickering in the glass. He stared at the files, at the coded exchanges that had reduced Aisha to an asset. His chest burned with fury. He ordered the servers seized, the operators restrained. But as he scanned the files, something unexpected appeared. Among the coded exchanges was a directive. Phase 3, Extraction. His blood ran cold. Extraction. They weren't just watching anymore. They were planning to take her. The realization hit him like a blade. The bruises, the surveillance, the threats, it had all been preparation. They had been testing him, measuring his reactions, waiting for the moment to strike. And now, that moment was near. He turned sharply, his voice cutting through the room. We move now. Double security at the penthouse. No one gets near her. His men obeyed instantly, but Zaid's mind churned. He had struck a blow tonight, dismantled one cell, but the network was larger. And with every move he made, they adapted. This was not a battle of strength. It was a battle of endurance. When he returned to the penthouse, Miriam rushed to him, her face pale. What happened? She asked. Zaid looked at her, his eyes burning. They're planning to take her. Miriam's hands trembled, her voice breaking. No, they can't. Zaid steadied her, his voice firm. They won't. Not while I'm here. Aisha appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. She had heard enough to understand. She stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. They want me because of you. Zaid knelt before her, his voice low. They want you because they think you're my weakness. But they don't understand. You're my strength. And that makes us dangerous. Her gaze held his, and for the first time, he saw not just fear but determination. She nodded slowly, as though accepting the weight of his words. That night, Zaid stood by the window, the city lights flickering below. He thought of the files of the word extraction. He thought of the masked leader, his confidence, his threats. And he thought of the vow he had made to protect her, no matter the cost. The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle ahead would not be won with a single strike. It would be a war of attrition, fought in shadows and silence. But he was ready. The monitors flickered, the device glowed, and the city pulsed below. Zaid whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the empty room. He would not let them take her. He would dismantle the network, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And as the night deepened, he knew the next chapter would bring the confrontation closer than ever. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who strike openly, but the ones who wait in silence, confident in their power. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his reflection staring back, he knew the next part of the war would test him in ways he had never faced before. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the looming extraction attempt and how far he will go to stop it, stay with me. The next part will bring the clash to his very doorstep, where every choice will decide who survives. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that felt staged, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Zaid stood in the penthouse corridor, every sense sharpened. He had dismantled one cell, uncovered coded directives, and learned of Phase 3. Tonight, he knew they would make their move. The penthouse had been transformed into a fortress. Guards patrolled every hallway. Sensors scanned every entrance. Alarms were primed. Yet Zaid understood that walls were only illusions. The enemy had already proven they could slip through cracks. He had to be ready not just for intrusion, but for confrontation. Miriam sat with Aisha in the living room, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter. Aisha's eyes were wide, alert, no longer the timid gaze of a child hiding bruises. She had grown sharper, stronger, shaped by the storm around her. Zaid watched her silently, his chest tightening. She was no longer just someone to protect. She was someone who gave him purpose. The first sign came just after midnight. A faint flicker on the monitors, a signal too subtle for ordinary eyes. Zaid leaned closer, his instincts screaming. The cameras at the service entrance went dark for 3 seconds, then returned. It was enough. They were here. He moved swiftly, signaling his men. The guards tightened their positions, weapons ready. Zaid himself strode to the entrance, his footsteps echoing against marble. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Then the breach. The doors shuddered as shadows slipped inside, masked figures moving with precision. They weren't reckless. They were coordinated, trained. Zaid's men engaged instantly, the clash erupting in bursts of violence. Steel met steel, fists collided, the penthouse echoing with chaos. Zaid moved through the fray, his focus unyielding. He wasn't a soldier, but he was relentless. He struck with precision, every move fueled by fury. He had faced rivals in boardrooms, but tonight he fought for something far greater. One of the masked figures broke through, heading toward the living room. Zaid's chest tightened. He lunged forward, intercepting, slamming the intruder against the wall. The mask slipped, revealing a hardened face, eyes burning with determination. "You can't stop us," the man spat. "She's ours." Zaid's grip tightened, his voice cold. "She belongs to no one." The fight raged, shadows colliding in bursts of violence. Miriam shielded Aisha, her voice trembling as she whispered reassurances. Aisha's eyes locked on Zaid, watching him battle. Her fear mingled with something new, belief. The intruders pressed harder, their movements calculated. They weren't here to kill. They were here to extract. Every strike, every maneuver was designed to push toward the girl. Zaid realized their strategy instantly. They wanted to overwhelm defenses, create distraction, and seize her in the chaos. He roared commands, his men tightening formation. The penthouse became a battlefield, every corner alive with struggle. Yet Zaid refused to yield. He fought with a ferocity that stunned even his own guards. Then, the moment. One of the intruders broke through, reaching the living room. Miriam screamed, clutching Aisha tighter. The figure lunged forward, arms outstretched. Zaid moved faster than he ever had. He slammed into the intruder, driving him to the floor. The impact echoed, the fight pausing for a heartbeat. Zaid's fist struck relentlessly until the mask shattered, revealing a face twisted with desperation. "You think you can take her?" Zaid growled. "You'll have to go through me." The intruder's eyes widened, fear flickering for the first time. He tried to speak, but Zaid silenced him with a final blow. The remaining figures faltered, their confidence shaken. They retreated, slipping back through the service entrance, vanishing into the night. The penthouse fell silent, the echoes of battle lingering in the air. Zaid stood in the living room, his chest heaving, his fists bloodied. Miriam clutched Aisha, tears streaming down her face. Aisha looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice soft but firm. "You stop them." Zaid knelt before her, his voice low. "I will always stop them, no matter how many times they come." Her gaze held his, and for the first time, she whispered words that pierced him deeply. "I believe you." The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle was far from over. Tonight had been only the beginning of Phase 3. The network would not stop. They would regroup, adapt, strike again. But he had proven something. To them, to her, to himself. He would not break. He stood by the window, the city lights burning below. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the silence. He would dismantle the network, no matter how deep it ran, no matter how many shadows it hid behind. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are not fought with armies, but with resolve. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his reflection staring back, he knew the next chapter would demand everything he had. The monitors flickered, the device glowed, and the city pulsed below. The war had begun, and Zaid was no longer just defending, he was attacking. If you want to see how Zaid escalates his counterstrike and begins dismantling the network piece by piece, stay with me. The next part will bring the clash into the open, where secrets unravel and choices carry consequences. The city's veins glowed with restless light, but Zaid no longer saw towers and contracts. He saw battlegrounds. The attempted extraction had proven the network's reach, their audacity, and their confidence. They had failed to take Aisha, but their retreat was not defeat, it was regrouping. Zaid knew they would strike again, stronger, smarter. Waiting for them was no longer an option. He gathered his circle in a discreet underground chamber, far from the penthouse. Maps, encrypted files, and intercepted communications sprawled across the table. His analysts had traced fragments of the network's operations to a financial hub disguised as a charity. On the surface, it funded schools and clinics. Beneath the facade, it funneled money into surveillance, recruitment, and covert strikes. Zaid studied the evidence, his jaw tightening. "We will dismantle this next," he said. "Cut the money, and we cut their reach." The team hesitated. "It's heavily protected," one warned. "Not by guards, but by legitimacy. They have allies in government, in corporations. If you strike them, you'll expose yourself." Zaid's voice was cold, steady. "They exposed themselves when they came for her. I don't care about legitimacy. I care about ending this." The plan was set. That night, Zaid moved through the city's financial district, his presence cloaked in silence. He entered the charity's headquarters with precision, his men disabling alarms and bypassing locks. Inside, the building gleamed with polished marble and golden plaques, a mask of benevolence hiding corruption. They reached the central office, where servers hummed quietly. Zaid approached the console, his reflection flickering in the glass. He scrolled through files, uncovering transactions disguised as donations. Millions of dollars flowed through accounts, funding operations across borders. And among the files, one directive stood out: Phase 4 Destabilization. His chest tightened. Destabilization. This wasn't just about Aisha anymore. This was about him, his empire, his influence. They wanted to break him publicly, to strip him of power until he was vulnerable. He copied the files, securing evidence. But as he turned to leave, alarms blared. The building's defenses had been triggered. Within seconds, armed men flooded the corridors, their movements sharp, coordinated. Zaid's men engaged instantly, the clash erupting in bursts of violence. Bullets ricocheted, shadows collided. Zaid moved through the chaos, his instincts sharpened. He wasn't a soldier, but he was relentless. He struck with precision, every move fueled by fury. He reached the exit, but the enemy pressed harder. One of them lunged forward, blocking his path. Their eyes locked, the tension thickening. The man's voice was sharp. "You think you can dismantle us? We are everywhere." Zaid's jaw tightened. "Then I'll burn you everywhere." The fight erupted, steel against steel, fists against flesh. Zaid struck with ferocity, his resolve unyielding. Finally, the man collapsed, defeated. Zaid pushed forward, his men covering him, until they burst into the night. The city lights flickered above, the air thick with smoke. Zaid stood in the street, his chest heaving, the stolen files clutched in his hand. He had struck a blow tonight, dismantling another piece of the network. But he knew this was only the beginning. When he returned to the penthouse, Miriam rushed to him, her voice trembling. "What happened?" Zaid looked at her, his eyes burning. "I cut their money, but they're planning more. They want to destabilize everything." Aisha appeared in the doorway, her gaze steady. She listened silently, her eyes reflecting the storm in his expression. She whispered softly, "They won't win." Zaid knelt before her, his voice low. "No, they won't, because we fight together." Her gaze held his, and for the first time, he saw not just fear but strength. She was no longer just someone to protect. She was becoming someone who stood beside him. That night, Zaid stood by the window, the city lights burning below. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the silence. He would dismantle the network, no matter how deep it ran, no matter how many shadows it hid behind. The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle ahead would not be won with a single strike. It would be a war of attrition, fought in shadows and silence. But he was ready. The monitors flickered, the device glowed, and the city pulsed below. Zaid whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the empty room. He would not let them take her. He would dismantle the network, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And, as the night deepened, he knew the next chapter would bring the confrontation closer than ever. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are not fought with armies, but with resolve. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his reflection staring back, he knew the next part of the war would test him in ways he had never faced before. If you want to see how Zaid confronts the looming destabilization attempt and how far he will go to stop it, stay with me. The next part will bring the clash into the open, where secrets unravel and choices carry consequences. The city woke restless, its headlines screaming with scandal. Zaid Khan's name blazed across every screen, every paper, every whisper in the streets. Overnight, accusations had surfaced: fraud, corruption, betrayal. Documents appeared online, leaked files that painted him as a man who had built his empire on deceit. Investors panicked, allies withdrew, rivals sharpened their knives. Zaid sat in his office, the storm raging around him. He knew the truth. The files were fabrications, carefully constructed by the network. This was Phase 4, destabilization. They had failed to take Aisha, so now they sought to dismantle him publicly, to strip him of power until he was vulnerable. His phone rang relentlessly, board members demanding answers, journalists pressing for statements, politicians distancing themselves. Yet Zaid remained calm. He had faced storms before, but this one was different. It wasn't about contracts or markets. It was about survival. Miriam entered quietly, her face pale. "They're trying to destroy you," she whispered. Zaid looked at her, his eyes steady. "They won't succeed, because they don't understand me. They think power is my foundation. It isn't. She is." Aisha appeared in the doorway, her gaze sharp. She had heard enough to understand. She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Then fight them. Not just for me. For yourself." Her words pierced him. He realized she was no longer just someone to protect. She was someone who gave him strength. That evening, Zaid gathered his circle again. The analysts spread the leaked files across the table, dissecting them. "They're sophisticated," one said. "Every detail looks authentic. They've built a narrative that will be hard to disprove." Zaid's jaw tightened. "Then we don't just disprove it. We expose them." The team hesitated. "If you go public, you risk everything. They'll strike harder." Zaid's voice was cold, steady. "I don't care. They've already declared war. I won't fight it in silence." The plan was set. The next morning, Zaid stood before cameras, his reflection flickering across screens worldwide. He spoke with precision, his voice sharp. He denied the accusations, but more than that, he revealed the truth. He showed fragments of the files his team had uncovered, evidence of manipulation, proof of a network operating in shadows. The world listened, stunned. Some believed him, others doubted. Rivals scoffed, allies hesitated. But Zaid didn't care. He wasn't speaking to them. He was speaking to the network. "You think you can break me with lies," he said, his voice echoing. "But lies are fragile, and when truth strikes, they shatter." The broadcast ended, but the storm did not. The network responded swiftly, releasing more files, more accusations. Social media erupted, the city buzzing with speculation. Yet Zaid remained unyielding. He had planted a seed of doubt, and he knew it would grow. That night, he returned to the penthouse. Aisha waited, her eyes wide. "Did it work?" she asked. Zaid knelt before her, his voice low. "Not yet. But it will. Because the truth is patient. And so am I." Her gaze held his, and for the first time, she smiled faintly. Then I'll be patient too. The storm inside him grew, fiercer than ever. He realized the battle ahead would not be won quickly. It would be a war of endurance, fought in shadows and silence. But he was ready. Days passed, the city restless. The accusation spread, but so did whispers of doubt. People began to question the files, to wonder who had released them. Zaid's evidence circulated quietly, undermining the network's narrative. The war was no longer just in the shadows, it was in the public eye. One evening, as Zaid studied the latest reports, a message appeared on the device. It was short, sharp, chilling. Phase 5 begins. His chest tightened. He had dismantled cells, cut money, exposed lies. Yet the network remained, adapting, evolving. He realized the battle was far from over. He stood by the window, the city lights burning below. He whispered to himself, a vow that echoed through the silence. He would dismantle the network, no matter how deep it ran, no matter how many shadows it hid behind. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are not fought with armies, but with resolve. And as Zaid tightened his grip on the railing, his reflection staring back, he knew the next chapter would demand everything he had. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.